Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Brunch with Brent. I'm super excited today. I'm tempted to say extra excited today to be joined by Peter Adams. Peter, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me. Super excited to chat with you.
Great. Welcome to Brunch. I am extra excited, like I was saying, to have you join me for this conversation. You're bringing together two of my very deep passions. One is open source technologies and ideas, and the other one is photography. And of course, we're going to dive into how that comes into your life. You know, I'm just talking about those two juxtapositions, and it's making me smile like crazy. So thank you for being the embodiment of that excitement.
Happy to embody that. Two of my favorite things as well. So
yeah, which is really cool. And the way I discovered some of your work was that Cheese, one of our friends and host at Jupiter Broadcasting, he mentioned one of your projects, which is the Faces of Open Source, which is a photography project that you're doing and have been doing for a while. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So I started that project, back in 2014, 2015.
Okay.
And, it's a portrait project, just basically photographing and exploring the open source community, people in the open source community. And my whole feeling was that open source often kind of gets relegated to these bizarro program names or acronyms. Or
there are a few of those, right?
Yeah, there's a couple million acronyms in the open source world. But it's finding the faces of the people and bringing a human element and really sort of seeing the community visually is not something that's super easy to do. It's super easy to browse GitHub pages. It's super easy to get on a mailing list. It's very hard to put a face with a name. And as a photographer, that really bugged me. So I just dove in and started doing portraits of notable and unsung faces in the open source community. Some people I sought out are fairly well known, but many of them are not. Many of them are new to open source. Many of them have played a critical role, but have been a little bit more unsung in the history books.
Right.
And so I really wanted to sort of create a collection that was representative of the community, and that people could see who the faces that are creating this amazing community and this amazing software, who they were. And so I started that, in 2015, and we're up over 100 portraits at this point. I think it's 120 something.
What a wonderful feat. Like that, 100 portraits for any professional photographer who's, really put their heart into a single portrait. Doing 100 is no small thing.
Yeah, it's been a really, it's been a great journey, and it's a project, that I have to fit in between other work and other projects. And sometimes I get lucky and, I'll go to a conference and there's a whole bunch of people that are, that I'm wanting to photograph that are at that conference. But oftentimes it's me loading the car and showing up at somebody's backyard or somebody's living room or somebody's front yard.
Really?
Yes, yeah, or office. Cram all the gear into a conference room and just kind of go from there. But and that's been the hardest part of the project, is just the logistics of getting people scheduled. Because as much as there's a good concentration of people in California where I am, but a lot of people are all over the map, and I get to New York a lot. We've done a lot of shoots in New York as well for people, but I have to try to time when people are traveling to the U.S. Maybe they're going to be in the same city I'm going to be in, or maybe I can extend a trip on another project to photograph them for this project. So the logistics part has really been the hardest part of getting to 120 plus people at this point. And last year we did, I think 18 or 19. The year before that I did 30. So it really depends kind of on, how logistics and schedules kind of align, how many more people we add.
And do you have someone kind of helping you both on the logistics end, connecting with people, and also on site when you're actually taking the photographs?
Well, on site, if I can, I'll have an assistant with me. But oftentimes, these are fairly simple shoots, and it's just me and a car full of equipment. If we're shooting in a studio, I'll tend to have an assistant, help with, setup or things like that. But usually it's really just me. I mean, I'm approaching people, reaching out, writing people. Everybody gets a random email from this random photographer saying he's doing a project. But actually, at this point, a lot of participants have been really great because they're referring me to other people, or they've been really gracious with their time, and they've kind of opened their Rolodex. So they make introductions to other people in the community on my behalf. And that's been really helpful and really, really amazing that people are willing to do that and see the project, grow and be successful through those introductions.
It has been so cool for me to see some of these portraits. I've mostly taken them in from your website. And it's true what you're saying. Like, we know maybe a handful of popular faces, the Linuses and such. But there are so many sort of intriguing looking people there that you just kind of want to click on and learn their story as well. I have really appreciated that connection of the visual and the sort of people side of things connected with the story, where you're a little bit more familiar with, the code they wrote or the project they worked on for decades or something like that. And has it kind of surprised you sometimes when you get to meet some of these people? Like, oh, they're not, the image that you may have made in your mind, because we all do, or how has that experience been, sort of meeting all these people?
I mean, the experience of meeting everybody has been amazing. It's been phenomenal. Just being able to spend time. I mean, sometimes I get an hour with somebody. Sometimes I only get, a few minutes with somebody. So, but all the times, I do, before every shoot, I do my research, and, I get online and I read, extensively about what they've done and their history and their background, and, if they've done any other interviews. So I research, I kind of know, something about the person, at least their public persona, by the time they show up on my set. But you never really can get a handle on somebody's personality until they're in front of your camera and you're face to face. And in some cases, yeah, I've been pleasantly surprised, 99% of the time.
Nice.
The few, a couple curveballs here and there, but for the most time, everybody in this community has been really wonderful and really gracious with their time, and really excited to participate in a project like this. And I think that, at this point, with it going on for a number of years now, I will get notes, from past participants that have been following, the project for a few years, or people that have just, have seen it kind of evolve over the years. And people have been really encouraging me to keep going, and are really appreciative that there's a documentation of this community, because there really hasn't been. And that was something that was so fascinating to me when I was doing the research on this project, was that this is such an important thing. Open source is such an important phenomena. And there's very little photographic documentation of the people, that have created this. I mean, there's tons of photos of Tim Berners-Lee and Vint Cerf, and, all, the mega, stars of the internet and the web, and, these massive, projects. Of course. And Linus has a lot of photos. There's actually a funny story about Linus when I photographed him.
Oh, I like funny stories.
I'll never forget it, because, I was concerned, Linus is, Linus is Linus. He's larger than life figure in the community, and confrontational at the same time, or controversial, I should say, maybe confrontational on mailing lists, but, slightly controversial. And I just, I had never met him before, and I didn't really, how sensitive he was going to be photographed, but he agreed, very, very quickly, and was very happy and accommodating, for our sitting. And, at the end, I make everybody sign a release, a photo release, as I'm sure you do when you do your shoots. I asked him if he had any issue signing that, and his note, his response to me was, "Have you seen the pictures of me on the internet?" And I was like, "Oh man, it's so refreshing that, most people are so concerned with images and how their photography is being used." And, I had done the photo research of him, and, there's you can just go to Google Images and see some pretty funny pictures of him, giving the finger to people and all sorts of stuff. I mean, but he was super accommodating and really, really generous with his time at a busy conference, to take the time to do a sitting with me. So that was really fun.
Yeah, I think as you certainly know, since you've been doing photography for a long while, and I certainly know because I am a professional photographer as well, there's this real opportunity when you get to do a portrait of someone. It ends up, if no one's ever had a professional portrait done, it's quite an intimate experience. And if you're with a great photographer, they will make that intimate experience a positive thing, make you feel the most comfortable you possibly can. And that can lead to some really fast connections, some really deep connections as well within, 5, 10, 15 minutes. So I imagine for you, and maybe even for those you're photographing, that it's kind of nice to have some of those discussions, at a busy conference, but you're going away into, I'm assuming, a room or something like that, and just having a bit of a breather and a really important connection. So has that been a nice portion of it for you, just like having that intimate time with some of these people?
Oh yeah. I mean, and what an honor to be able to get that. I mean, most of these people are on planes, 24/7, and, between projects and their day job, and then, the conference circuit. I mean, the life of an open source advocate is quite busy, actually, is what I've learned.
Right.
I never know, some people, it's taken me years to schedule. I have email threads, that go for multiple years trying to find the overlap in schedules, and, trying to get somebody to be in the same place that I'm going to be, or for me to be in the same place they're going to be. And it's very difficult. So when I do get them in front of the camera, you're absolutely right. It is an intimate thing. And I think most people have not had their portrait done before. And I always ask people when I photograph them if they've had their portrait taken before, not like not a corporate headshot type portrait, but like, have they ever really been in a portrait sitting? And it's very rare for somebody to have had that experience. And I think, as it takes a little while to get past the discomfort of being in front of a camera. And my sets tend to be, pretty elaborate. I mean, if we're shooting in a studio, it's a full-on photo studio, and, these are all portraits on white. So it's,
So you're shooting with more than one light, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's 6 lights and 5 C stands and flags, and it's a whole. It's an involved lighting setup to do these portraits. So I think, and some people have never been on a professional photo shoot before. They've never been on set before. So it takes a little while to try to get people into the zone and have them settle.
Yeah, that setup alone can be intimidating, right?
Yeah, it's just it's a lot for somebody to just walk into if they've never experienced it before. But then then people typically relax, and you find the rhythm, and you find the flow, and you develop the connection, and the photos come from that.
Well, you made me smile and laugh actually when we first connected on the phone to set up this conversation, because one of the first things you did, and I bet you didn't even consciously realize you did this, But one of the first things you did was ask me about 5 to 7 questions about me, just to kind of, we were developing a connection, which is important. But I was like, aha, this is exactly what I do to other people when I'm, setting them up for a portrait but that's just become my personality. Is I've become really curious about people, and you were doing that to me, and I was like, oh, I see. We're two photographers sitting in the same room here.
Yeah, it's like if people are going to listen to this and like, I didn't get one answer out of either of them because they were so busy asking each other questions. No, that's just what we have to do. I mean, that's how you learn. I mean, for me at least, that's why I pick up the camera, is to have that experience, to connect with somebody, to learn something about another person, and to have that connection. And of course, the art that comes out of it is very satisfying, but the process of getting to that art and learning about the person and learning about their experiences is, I think that's why a lot of people become photographers, because that's what they want to be doing with their life. They want to be learning and continually learning, essentially.
You're describing me right there.
Yeah, exactly. I know it.
And photography, certainly for me, and I imagine for you as well, has allowed me to spend time in environments that otherwise I would never, ever have access to, right? Like, for instance, for you, this project is allowing you access to people you would likely otherwise never talk to in 100 years, right?
Totally.
But there's something about photography's ability to connect people and allow you to experience other people's lives in a deep, meaningful way for an afternoon or, a few minutes even. That is one of the most exciting things to me.
Yeah, it's definitely a passport, that a secret kind of passport that, not everybody has. And, it gives you that entree, just into these experiences that you're looking to have, or you're looking to, get access to. And it's amazing. I do a lot of personal projects, and I'm always shocked, when I come up with an idea for a personal project, like Faces of Open Source or another one of my projects. And, when you're first doing the research, you're always thinking to yourself, oh man, is this ever going to happen? Is anyone ever going to say yes to this project? Are they really going to let me in there with my camera to do X, Y, and Z? And I always think, there's no way, it's never going to happen. And then you write the email and somebody comes back and they're like, yeah, I'll do that. Or yeah, I'll give you that access. And it's amazing how welcoming people are, with the right project in the right context. The camera really is sort of a passport into these other worlds and situations.
And yet with that passport comes a lot of responsibility, right? If you're given this access and you kind of don't respect it, that does a real disservice to everyone. And so I feel like you kind of take on this really important role in nurturing the people you're also running into. That's clearly gotten you more and more yeses as you dive into people's networks, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, it's a huge responsibility, and I think that's also where the perfectionist, a lot of photographers I find are perfectionists as well, because then you get this access, you've done all this legwork to get to the place where you can photograph somebody, and you want to do the best job that you could possibly do. Every single photograph, every single sitting, every single subject, you want to make sure that you're doing your best on behalf of that person and doing the sitting justice, because the photographs are hopefully going to live on. And, this is a super important, topic or project that you're spending time on. You want to make sure it's the best that it could ever be. So you go the extra mile and you knock yourself out every time, because that's the quid pro quo of getting access, is that you're going to give it 150% every time.
I'm sitting here nodding profusely at all your words, like, yep, that's how you need to do it. And so now that you have, 100 plus photographs under your belt for this specific project, I guess, where are you hoping that they live long term? Is there a place you'd like to give the greater public access to them, or some kind of access from the open source community? Like, what do you see as the end goal?
Well, I think originally when I started the project, I thought, if I can get access to, a representative enough group of the, within the community, that it would be a great book. And so I've been trying to get a book, together and design a book and get it out, seriously for the last year. And, it's just been lots of life getting in the way of that.
Yeah. And a book is no small thing to do well,
Exactly. So ultimately, I really do want to do that. I think that, being able to sit down with a book and look at the photographs, in person and in a large size as well, is really appealing and impactful. And I think that that's going to be the most accessible way for people to physically get their hands on the photographs. But I think, because it's open source and so much of open source is, online, and it's just the website is going to be really the focal point of the project over time.
Mm-hmm.
I have done some exhibits like this last year. We exhibited all the photos at OSCON in the OSCON conference in Portland.
Nice.
And, these are, sort of, short exhibits in the sense that, OSCON is really, a little less than a week. So we do these digital exhibits on, monitors and a portrait orientation, and it looks really good, and it's really impactful, and it's a nice way to do very short-term exhibits. I would like to exhibit the prints just because I do all the prints myself, and I love printing. So, be an excuse to be able to sort of hunker down and do some exhibition quality printing. But that's sort of a major undertaking. I have to find it has to be the right venue, and it has to be a long enough term exhibit to justify the expense of doing something like that.
Yeah. Traveling with prints is that's quite a feat.
Yeah, exactly. Typically you're mounting them and then shipping them mounted. And these are all, fairly high resolution, these are all big files. So they print life size essentially. And so it's costly to move stuff around. But I hope to do a real physical exhibit of the prints at some point. Maybe in conjunction with launching the book. We'll see. That's probably going to be the right time to do it. But in the meantime, conferences will invite me to come and, exhibit the photos digitally, on monitors. And that has been a really nice way to get the community to see them and interact with them, beyond just them being on the web.
There's nothing like seeing a print in person, either through a book or my favorite, which would be as large as possible, right? And in person, especially if the artist is there, there's something about that human connection that you just can't get on the web, as wonderful as the web is. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. The definition of the prints is, and I've printed all of these portraits. I have all the work prints that I do, because printing is actually part of my editing process with, especially with black and white. You can only get the photograph to be, so far on the computer, and then, I have to print it and sit with it. And, sometimes I tell people, I say, it may be a month or two before you hear back from me on this, just because I'm traveling or something like that. But also it's not a quick edit. The portraits take some time to really sit with, and you kind of have to marinate in the portrait, if you will, and put it up on the wall, and, make sure you've got the tonality right, and, come back to it in a day or two, and, really just make sure it's dialed in right. And these faces are so, the faces of the subjects on that project are so awesome, that it's so nice to be able to get kind of right up to it. Whereas with a monitor, you're not really going to get right up to it the way you can with a print.
Nor will it necessarily do the photographic work any justice, right?
I mean, monitors are pretty good, but yeah, it's not the same. It's not the same.
I love hearing a little bit about your process there. It sounds to me like you're really bringing a lot of your heart and your attention to showing every single person and every single face, I guess bringing them to their very best for the experience that you had. So I feel like that's a really important thing to do for people. And I love hearing sort of that depth of attention that you're bringing to it. So thank you for doing that for everyone you're photographing. You know, it feels like we've all got stories to tell, and capturing people that way is a real gift, really.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes back to the 150%. You know, if you're going to get somebody to show up in front of your camera, you're going to go all the way and beyond just to make sure that that's the best portrait. You know, and an honest portrait too. You know, of them, and that's, you know, as a portrait photographer, you know, that's always a balance you're trying to strike, which is making an authentic, you know, sort of honest portrait of somebody that reveals something, you know, that you get a little bit of an idea who the person is, or something about their personality through the portrait, as opposed to a highly stylized, rendition of somebody that may not really be, you know, how you saw the person in that moment. So that's always a balance you're trying to strike.
The life of photography, yeah? It's such a great one. Can I ask you how you originally got into photography? Like, what was it about photography itself that kind of grabbed you and wouldn't let go?
So I, you know, first picked up a camera really in high school. It started with the high school photography. And I would say I was pretty much hooked, you know, within the first photography class I ever took in high school.
You got the bug, right?
Yeah, and my high school was really good. It had like a really good, it had a photo lab, and it had a really good set of staff and teachers. And it had like multiple levels, you know, it had like the photo 1 and the photo 2 and the photo 3, you know, courses. So you could really, over, you know, the course of high school, you could be doing photography all through high school and continually learning new stuff, you know, the entire time. And, you know, I just got hooked in it. And, you know, I would show up on the weekends to use the lab, and the teacher would give me the key, and, you know, she trusted me to, you know, be in there. And, you know, this is all film. So you were basically developing your own black and white film and then doing your own printing in the darkroom, and
which is such a special experience. If anyone's ever had that experience, it's like nothing else.
Oh yeah. I spent so many hours in the darkroom, you know, in my teenage years and in my 20s. I don't miss it at all now, just because it's such a...
Yeah, we're lucky now, right?
But, you know, that's when I sort of first got into it. And I had a couple of friends that were really into it as well. So that really helped. And I was going to go to school after, you know, after I graduated from high school. I became a teaching assistant at the International Center of Photography in New York.
Nice.
And TA'd, you know, a few classes in exchange for getting access to their dark rooms. So I would print there, and then I would be a TA for visiting photographers that would do their classes at ICP. And I just thought, oh man, this is the greatest thing in the world. This is what I want to do. And when I went off to college, I almost went to art school. I kind of thought about it, and I wound up going to college at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And their photo lab was just abysmal. So I petitioned the student government for a bunch of money, and actually was able to build a new photo lab for them when I was an undergrad there.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah. And then, you know, like I just, you know, this is what I was going to do. You know, I was just like total photo nerd, total darkroom nerd. And then I started to get into computers because at that point, Trinity was one of the first schools in the country that had wired their residential dorms with Ethernet.
Oh.
So every student had Ethernet jack in their dorm room, and the school was hooked up to the internet via T1, which at the time was pretty good bandwidth back. This is the mid 90s, early mid 90s. So I had started getting into computers because my best friend was at Dartmouth, and Dartmouth, had this very forward thinking email system. They had developed their own email, and the whole campus was electronic, and everybody used email to communicate up there. And we wanted to send email back and forth to each other, from Trinity to Dartmouth. So to do that, I had to get an account on the VAX, as this, basically mainframe that was in the computer center.
Right.
And to do that, I had to learn, Unix commands, because the VAX ran, I don't remember what variant of Unix, but, maybe it was System 5 or whatever it was.
I see. So I can see how this is where it all begins. You
can see this is exactly where it all begins. So, I log in, I've got a Mac and I'm using, Telnet or, Telnet program to log into this VAX and type in, these commands to change directories and open up, the mail program, which at the time was, I think it was Pine was what I was using to start. And I just had to learn these Unix commands, and I would get stuck and I would screw something up, and I would have to go down to the computer center and I would have to bug the mail administrator to show me how to, flush my mail queue because I had screwed something up. And, so I started to learn all these commands and these funny programs, and he would give me these one-liners, these one-line shell commands, with pipes and stuff that would, grep my mail spool and output it to a text file so I could read it because I had screwed something up and Pine wasn't recognizing it, or I don't remember what it was at this point, but I had to learn all these programs. And I remember at that point thinking, like, who the hell comes up with the names of all these things? I mean, awk, sed,
of course,
Pine, what the hell, what does this all stand for? What is all this? And I mentally, I look at that now as like, yeah, I remember having that thought. And then I kind of put it out of my mind. And, then, 20 years later, and I come back to this project, the Faces of Open Source, I'm photographing, Al Aho of Awk and Peter Weinberger, the people that created Awk, the people that wrote SED, the people that, Ken Thompson, the people that came up with the algorithms behind grep and, SendMail and all these Unix programs that, I first interacted with, just when I, kind of got into the internet.
What's most interesting to me about that, as a tiny aside, is that most computer users these days never ever interact with any of those, right? Although they were just so important for the timeline of computers and timeline of Unix and the open source and all of that. So it's great for you to have a little bit of that personal history, and now a few years later you're getting to meet some of these people. That must feel really cool.
It was cool, and in fact, with this project, that's kind of where I started. I started with the Unix, the folks at Bell Labs that wrote Unix, and I started with that community. And then I started photographing from there. I started photographing the BSD community and then the Linux community. And I kind of went through operating systems, and then
you're like tracing history almost, right?
Exactly. I figured I'll start at the beginning and then kind of work my way down the family tree, and then out to these other communities. And it's been really, really cool to sort of retrace some of my own personal computing history through this project, and then meet some of the people, who are behind all this tech that we, I mean, as you say, most people don't even interact with it anymore. But what's amazing and what's totally astonishing to me and is so wonderful is that all of this tech is still living in their computers right under the glossy GUI. If you're on a Mac, it's, you've got BSD in there. And people are, or iOS or Android, you have Linux, and, all of this open source, all this tech, and all of that fundamental Unix goodness, the design and the core programs that have since been rewritten with the GNU project and all this stuff, they're all living on everybody's computer. They may not be interacting with it directly, but they're all still there. And that's such a cool thing.
I find it really cool and fascinating, but at the same time, there's a hint of like, it's a bit tragic in some ways because it doesn't often get celebrated in the ways that perhaps it should, maybe it's unfair to expect every single computer user to want to celebrate, the simplest of tools that make everything run. But wouldn't it be great if we could just all say thanks?
I totally agree with you. I mean, and I think, when I started doing this project, I think that was really one of the driving forces for me behind the project, more, in addition to the personal interest of just meeting a lot of these pioneers that have developed this, was, how do we get this story out there, right? Because without all of this technology and without all of this software specifically, most of which is open source at this point, we wouldn't have any of this stuff that we're relying on now. And you're absolutely right that most people don't know it's there. They don't know that every time they log into a website, they're relying not just on the open source nature of the web, the protocols that run the web, but they're using hundreds of open source programs every time the page is rendered. Mm-hmm. There's hundreds of open source programs, tens of thousands of lines of code, at work, open source code at work, bringing that web page to them, pulling down that next email, transferring that file, up, to the cloud. All of that is open source. And without that, we'd be in a very different world, right?
Oh, yeah.
I really felt like it was important to get that story out there. And my thinking is, as a photographer, what can I do? I can try to bring that story to life through photography and specifically through the people, and the humans behind all this amazing code, and put that on display so that people realize, hey, all this, I am relying on this. This is an amazing phenomena that is responsible for getting us to where we're at today. And it should be celebrated. It should be acknowledged and celebrated. And hopefully the photography, helps do that. That's the goal of the project at this point.
Yeah, it's your way of giving back with the gifts that you have to open source, which is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, totally.
And so I wanted to jump back to your history a little bit. You were driving us through, a little bit of your history early with some of the Unix stuff. And I know that a lot of that leads into your discovering open source. So I wanted to kind of, if you can walk us through that a little bit more. So you were just telling us, that you were discovering Unix and playing with email, the deep depths of email.
I was on the VAX sending email to Dartmouth. I got very interested in the internet, just being able to transfer information and being able to disseminate information. And, I started to discover this thing called Usenet, which is, again, most people today, wouldn't know what that was if they're just kind of getting familiar with the internet. But, essentially the worldwide discussion, news system, with topics on everything in the world, sort of the precursor to the web, if you will. And I started discovering that. And then this thing called NCSA Mosaic showed up, and I immediately saw, wow, this is really interesting. And the first time I saw it, and the first time I saw a web page, I thought, oh, this is going to be a great way to show my photography. So I was like, oh, this is great. I can't wait to put my photography up on a web page, because up until that point, and this, if you wanted to share your photography with somebody, you're in the dark room making prints for people. And the way that I print, and used to print and print today, even still, is it's very elaborate. But back then in the dark room, it's not about just putting the paper underneath and exposing the paper, and out comes the print like you're at a drugstore getting a print done. It's an involved process of dodging and burning and manipulating the light as it comes out of the enlarger and doing contrast masks and all the stuff today that you do in Photoshop, doing that on an analog way, waving your hand in front of the light. And I could never really truly get two prints to be identical. I mean, you would write down your instructions, but it would take a phenomenally long time. And every print was kind of a one of a kind piece of art. So if you wanted to give a print to somebody, that was a big deal. If you wanted to share your photography and show it to somebody, you had to print it out. And wow, that could be an elaborate, really time-consuming process. So here comes the web, and I'm thinking, great, I'll just scan in the print and I'll make a web page, and I can just send the web page to people and they can look at my photography that way. And I was like, this is going to be the greatest thing in the world.
You were right.
So I started talking to some friends about it, and they're like, wow, we could do a lot of cool stuff with this. We could provide information, poetry and writing. And we kind of got the idea to do a little magazine, sort of like a student magazine. I was at that point doing, photography for the newspaper periodically as well, being photo geek. But we thought, well, we could get a whole magazine up on the web, and we could get submissions from all of our friends at other colleges via email. Because now that we know how to use that, they could just send in writing periodically, and we could then publish this thing on the web. And, I look back on that now and I'm like, wow, that was like, maybe one of the best ideas I ever had at that point in time.
It sounds kind of bold too at the time, right?
Yeah, at that point in time. And we developed this little magazine that went up that was the first magazine on the web.
That's awesome.
And we would get contributions from all over the internet, and we would publish this. And sometimes we'd put our photography up, and sometimes it would be, reported stories from journalist students. And, it would just be a mix of different things. And we're having a good time with it. And, all this while I'm figuring, well, I'm going to graduate from college and go back to New York, and maybe I can get a job assisting somebody and, start my photography career.
So like the traditional photography path, I suppose, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was always in the back of my mind was, I want to have my own studio. I want to live in a loft and be a photographer and, go down that New York City photographer path.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But one day I got an email from out of the blue from this guy who was the head of an ad agency in Silicon Valley, a guy by the name of Dave Karlik, who's a dear friend now and has been a mentor to me since that first email. And he wrote me saying, hey, I saw, some of my guys sent around this magazine that you're doing. We're an ad agency that does all the internet work for the White House and Netscape and, Chrysler. And, this is in sort of the mid 90s when nobody had a website. Everybody was trying to get on board, and he was in Silicon Valley, and it was a small agency. It was a small sort of cutting edge boutique agency that was doing all of this really early web work. It's an agency called Poppy Tyson. And he said, we have, this group in Silicon Valley doing this, but, you're in New York and I want to set up a whole New York operation. Can you come in and, can we talk?
Wow.
And so I go into New York, I go in for this interview and we're talking, and he's like, okay, show me your website. And of course, I couldn't, anytime you're doing a live demo, you can't get anything to work. So
of course,
yeah, I couldn't pull up the website. So I'm just,
oh no.
Right. So I'm just like describing it to him, and I'm like, this is what it is. And this is how it is. And, we'll look at it later, but for some reason we can't get it on the computer. anyway, so he's like, well, this is really great. He's like, I want to hire you could come in and do all this interactive stuff. And, you're in an ad agency and it's this creative environment. And, I think you really love it. And I was like, oh my God, wow, somebody wants to pay me to do creative work on this new platform called the internet, which is like going to be, at that point I was just like, this is going to be the biggest thing in the world. And I was like, absolutely. This sounds great. And so I went for an interview there when, I thought, well, maybe I should interview somewhere else. And I had gotten another email from the guys at Time Inc. because they had an early internet presence. And I went in to interview there, and I didn't really like the folks over there as much as Poppy Tyson and working for Dave. And so I took this job working for Poppy Tyson, doing this early internet work in the early 90s. And that just took me on this whole different trajectory. And I spent 20 years doing internet tech ventures, and photography was kind of on the side where I could fit it in. And so I described to my, and that was up until, a little over 10 years ago, I decided it was time to get back to photography. So I always joke to people that photography is my first love and second career, having spent, 20 years doing internet and technology startups in New York and Silicon Valley. And that's really where I got really inundated with open source. That's really, kind of my first exposure to open source was after I left Poppy Tyson. I in the heyday of the .com bubble, I had started a company, that did, analytics, web analytics, very similar to sort of an online SaaS service, very similar to what Google has now with Google Analytics.
Sounds like you're a bit earlier than they were.
Yeah, way earlier than Google. No, there was no Google at that point. And it was in the sort of heyday of the bubble. And we raised a bunch of money, and this was going to be, this big thing. And I was really into, the data and how people were using these websites, and that was really fascinating to me. So we started this company, and we're trying to get this thing off the ground. And this was in '99. Literally, like, couldn't have been like. It was the best timing to raise a bunch of money, but then it was the worst timing in the world to operate a company. And, there was no cloud, there was no nothing. I mean, to get these businesses off the ground back then, you literally needed tens of millions of dollars in capital to purchase hardware, stick it in a data center. I mean, luckily at that point, the co-location model of co-locating, instead of building out your own data center, you could just rent some space and co-locate your equipment in someone else's data center. So luckily, like, we didn't need, $100 million to build a data center network. We could just co-locate, but you still needed tens of millions of dollars to purchase storage from EMC and servers from Sun and database licenses from Oracle, and, all of this huge iron to crunch these numbers and to do data processing at that point. So we raised this money, we purchased all this equipment. And then when the .com bubble burst and we needed to raise more money, we couldn't. And, we kind of wound up having to sell the business, which we wound up doing that and sold it to a company called search engine, ironically enough, called LookSmart out in San Francisco. But, the funny story I always tell about my first exposure to open source was, while we're building this web analytics company, we purchased all this big iron from Sun. We purchased literally like this thing that looks like, I'm sure you've seen Star Wars or, those movies or any of the Star Wars movies. They all have this same thing where Obi-Wan Kenobi goes and like has to shut off the force field of the Death Star so that the Luke Skywalker and the crew can come in and blow it up. And he goes out on like, this parapet, and there's this big like monolith thing, and he's got to pull these latches, on like 4 sides, and it's this hulking like tower.
Yeah.
We had to buy one of those. I always joke like that's what we had to buy to run that business.
Did you have a Death Star to put it into as well? Or what?
It was literally, it looked like a Death Star. It looked like the control panel of the Death Star. It was this Sun's biggest computer, their E10K, its infamous computer. It was so big, it required a forklift to get it into the data center. And, it was just massive. And we bought it because, it was like at that point, running lots of small computers and clustering them, wasn't as, that wasn't an obvious, easy pattern to use at that point. It was much easier for us to just have one big computer with lots of CPUs. So we decided we would buy this big computer with lots of CPUs and we'd run Oracle on it. And Oracle had promised through their software, that their database, you could run a query across multiple CPUs. This product they had called Oracle Parallel Query, which probably cost us $50,000 just to purchase the license for that thing.
Oh man.
In hindsight, it's all so funny. I'm just shaking my head as I tell this story. We're thinking, oh great, that's how we're going to get the throughput we need for these data warehousing queries is we'll run this Oracle, software across all these multiple CPUs and this big Sunbox, and we'll have enough power to do all the data warehousing queries we need to do to run the business.
That must have seemed pretty exciting at the time, because it sounds like you're combining some pretty high tech of the time, right? Is that the feeling you got?
It was super exciting. I mean, to be able to put all this tech to work and, in service of running what would later be called SaaS, a SaaS product, instead of like shipping people CDs and having them install it, we would run all the hardware and they would just ship us the data, would come to us, and we would do all the processing on our end. So it was a lot of new stuff. It was like a whole new world of the internet. It was a whole new world of analyzing websites, all sorts of new technology. And we were so excited, and we had all this money from venture capitalists and all this stuff. And we get all this stuff in the data center and we install the software and we start running it through its paces, and we just can't get it to work.
Oh, no.
It's just the Oracle software, it won't use more than one CPU per query.
So the promise they've made isn't coming true.
The promise they made is not coming true. And of course, we've paid more money than God for a support contract. So, my CTO is on the phone and we're trying to work with them, and we escalated and escalated and escalated through their system. And ultimately it just comes back to like, yeah, that's a bug. That's a bug. We're going to have to get a fix for that, out to you. And we're like, okay, great. When can we expect, how many days will that take? And they're like, oh, no. We're not talking, that's the wrong, days is not the right metric, the right way to measure this,
oh no,
this will come out in the next release cycle. And, that could be, weeks, it could be months. And we're like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, we've got our whole stack you guys promised us this would work. And we bought all this stuff. And, of course we're just like this naive, group of 20 somethings trying to make all this work.
But it sounds like your business was sort of relying on that function.
We're like, Jesus, what are we going to do? Like, we're kind of screwed on this now. So my CTO is like, okay, look, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to use the Oracle database differently. We're going to have to do the data processing off of this thing. I've started experimenting with this thing called Linux, and I think we could just get at this point, we'd spent all our money on this E10K.
Right.
So we're like, okay, well, we could just get some really inexpensive computers and try to use Linux in a cluster to do the data processing.
When he first suggested it, did that seem like kind of depressing, because you've focused all your attention on this dream product, and here you are maybe putting together a few, like, it sounds like clearly lesser computers?
Well, it was more like, oh my God, I hope that works.
Right.
It was more like, oh, my fingers are crossed. Like, this is of course also like, I'm like, well, how much is Linux going to cost us? And all this. And he's like, no, Linux is free. It's open source. And, we don't have to pay for that. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, but is it going to work?
Well, it's a valid question, right?
And his answer to me, and I'll never forget it, was, if it doesn't, we can fix it. And I was like, oh, right. I'm like, right. Because we're screwed waiting for Oracle here. And so that's what we did. We bought a bunch of, commodity, commodity computers and Intel computers. And we ran Linux on it, and we did our data processing that way. And we used one CPU at a time in this big hulking Death Star of a Sun computer for running for the database. And the ironic thing about that entire experience, as kind of crazy and depressing as it was, as as the bubble is bursting all around us, and we're realizing, God, we've we can't raise more money for the business, and it's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars a month to run. We're gonna have to sell the company, and because the .com had burst, the bubble had burst at that point. And I remember it was the last couple of days of closing down our office, which was down on Wall Street, and we're just kind of tidying everything up and getting the space ready, getting all of our stuff out of the space. And this FedEx guy comes and starts knocking on the door. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what this is. I wonder who's, we haven't ordered anything. We're like days away from just turning out the lights on this office because we had sold the company to LookSmart in San Francisco, and all the operations were moving out to San Francisco. And I'm like, oh, what's this? I wonder what this FedEx is. And I go and I sign for the FedEx and I open it, and it's literally a 25 CD-ROM patch kit from Oracle. With the fix for the parallel server bug that we had filed 8 months before.
Well, it did come as they promised.
It finally came. It was like so little, so late, so irrelevant. Like we had moved on so far beyond that, but it was just so ironic that here we are, like we couldn't get the tech to work. We're waiting and waiting. We have to give up on it. We go to open source, and like one of the last days of the history of the company, 8 months too late, the bug fix comes from the commercial software provider. And I just remember thinking, I'm holding this stuff in my hand right before I threw it in the garbage. And I'm saying to myself, I will never, ever, one, buy Oracle software again. But two, I just won't ever make that mistake to be beholden to a commercial software vendor for running anything on my business, because you could go bankrupt. Like it could bankrupt you. It could be like the fatal flaw in your technology stack, and you could then be, completely handcuffed on dealing with it. And that was a hard lesson to learn. It all worked out in the end. We sold the company and it was all fine, but wow, what a lesson. And that was the beginning of, another 15 years of running everything on open source. Every venture I ever did, every company I ever worked for after that, it was all open source. And, me convincing people, no, we're not going to renew that Oracle license. No, we're not going to buy more Sun equipment, and it was like, I was like Dr. No for 10 years in these companies, getting people weaned off of this commercial proprietary software, and into using open source. So that was how I got into it. That was my that was my indoctrination by fire, if you will.
What a powerful moment and turning point for you, right? And I could see why it's such a deep part of you now, in trying to both celebrate it and sharing it with others. That's an amazing story. Well, listeners, we're going to take a tiny break here for now. Stay tuned for part 2 coming later this week, where Peter and I explore more topics like open source photography workflows, artificial intelligence, and the future of photography.